All right. So today we're going to be diving into something, well, honestly, it's crucial for anyone who's involved in software development,
Yeah.
or really even anyone who relies on software working, flawlessly.
Right.
We're talking about test planning,
Yeah.
and we've got a ton of research and case studies we've been digging into, and I think we've got some really interesting
Oh, yeah.
nuggets of knowledge to share to help people
For
understand how
sure.
to create like a roadmap for success when it comes to test planning.
Yeah, you can think of it like, when you're constructing a skyscraper,
Okay.
you're not just going to start piling up the steel and the glass without some sort of like plan, right? You got to have a detailed blueprint.
Makes sense.
And test planning is kind of that blueprint for software. It ensures that each component is really carefully looked at and checked out and validated before it, actually goes live.
So we're not just talking about like finding bugs here.
No, no, it's way bigger than that. Test planning is really about reducing risks,
Yep.
getting everyone who's involved on the same page and ultimately making sure the software, it does what it's supposed to do, that it meets those user needs
Right.
and that it functions the way it should. And what I think is really interesting is that when you've got a solid test plan in place, it can actually end up saving you like time and money
Oh, okay.
in the long run because you're kind of preventing these big, expensive issues from popping up later.
So you're like preventing those like fires that could happen.
Exactly, yeah. It's like being proactive instead of reactive.
Gotcha. So can you give us an example of how like not having a test plan could really backfire? Like what could happen?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Um, let's take a healthcare application,
But
something that handles sensitive patient data.
high stakes.
Yeah, very high stakes. If it's not like thoroughly tested for any kind of security vulnerabilities, you could have a data breach. And that's disastrous. I mean, first of all, it's a PR nightmare, but then you could also be looking at like legal issues and people just they lose trust.
Yeah, you lose trust in the platform.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's really it's crucial to have that testing in place.
Yeah, that's a really powerful example of
Yeah.
why this is so important. So, okay, so we kind of have an idea why test planning is important, but what are like the core components that make a test plan like really effective? Like what needs to be in it?
Okay, so a really well-structured test plan should cover a few key areas. And the first one is defining those test objectives.
Right.
So what are we trying to achieve with this testing? What are we specifically looking at? Are we focused on performance, security? Is it usability, or is it some combination of all of those?
So it's kind of like setting our goals for what we want to accomplish with the testing.
Exactly, yeah. It's all about clarity from the start.
Gotcha.
Then you have to figure out the scope of your testing. So what parts of the software are we actually going to test? And maybe more importantly, what are we not going to test?
Right.
This is super important for those like massive projects where it's just not feasible to test absolutely everything at once.
So it's about prioritization, like we were talking about with risk, focusing our efforts on the most important parts.
Yeah, exactly. You have to be strategic about it.
Okay, so what happens after we've like defined that scope? What's next?
All right. So next you've got to establish your testing criteria. A lot of people call this like entry and exit criteria.
Mhm.
So it's basically what conditions need to be met before we can even start testing.
Gotcha.
And then what are the criteria that tell us, okay, testing's done, we're good to go.
Okay, so like a starting line and a finish line.
Exactly.
Okay. Can you give me an example, though, of how that actually works in practice?
Okay, let's say you're testing a mobile banking app.
Okay, yeah.
An entry criterion might be something like, is the test environment totally set up?
Right.
Do we have all the different mobile devices? Do we have all the different operating systems we need to test on?
You know, make sure it works on everything.
Right, exactly, yeah. Got to make sure we have that comprehensive coverage.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about an exit criterion? Like, how do you know when you're actually done testing?
Good question. So an exit criterion could be something like, have all the critical bugs related to security and the core functions
Right.
and found, and then importantly, have they been fixed?
Okay.
You don't want to release an app that you know has security flaws.
No, absolutely not.
So those are the kinds of things you consider for your exit criteria.
So it's about making sure the software meets a certain level of quality before it goes out into the world.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay. So what comes after we figure out those criteria, the entry and exit points?
All right, so then we have to develop the actual test strategy.
Okay.
So this is where you're deciding, like, how are we actually going to do this testing? What specific methods are we going to use? Are we going to do mostly manual testing? That's where you have humans actually, like, interacting with the software?
Right, right.
Or are we going to go more towards automated testing, where we use tools to do a lot of that work? Or maybe it's a mix of both.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about automated testing. What are some of the advantages of using that?
Yeah, so automated testing can be a huge help, especially for tasks that are like super repetitive
Right,
or things that are really prone to human error if, a person was doing them over and over again.
right.
One example is regression testing. So that's where you're basically retesting something that's already been tested
Okay,
just to make sure that a new change to the code hasn't like broken something that was already working.
makes sense.
And that's something that a computer can often do much more efficiently than a person.
Yeah, it frees up the humans to do the more like complex stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. You can focus on the more creative and strategic aspects of testing.
Gotcha. So it's about finding the right balance between those two approaches.
Yeah, for sure. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. It really depends on the project.
Okay. So after we've figured out our strategy, what comes next?
Then it's all about the people. We have to assign roles and responsibilities.
Okay.
So who's going to be the test lead? The person who's in charge of the whole process.
Right, like the captain of the ship.
Exactly, yeah. And then who's going to be responsible for designing the tests, running them, and then reporting on the results?
So making sure everyone knows what they're doing and who they report to.
Absolutely, yeah. Having those clear roles and responsibilities just makes everything run so much smoother.
Okay, so we've got our team, we've got our roles. What else is there?
Now we have to think about the resources we're going to need.
Okay, like what kind of resources?
So things like software licenses for any testing tools we're going to use. Maybe we need hardware like servers or mobile devices, and sometimes even cloud computing resources.
Wow, so it's pretty involved logistically.
Yeah, it can be.
What else is super important to include in the plan?
We have to do a risk assessment.
Okay.
So we need to think about like what could go wrong, what are the potential challenges we might face, and most importantly, how can we prevent those from happening, or at least minimize the impact if they do happen?
So like a plan B, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. You always got to be prepared for the unexpected.
Makes sense. Can you give me an example? Like what's a common risk in software testing and how would you address it?
Yeah. One that comes up all the time is something called scope creep.
Okay, I've heard of that, but I don't really know what it means.
So basically, it's when the scope of testing, what we're planning to test, starts expanding beyond what we initially planned.
Oh, okay.
Maybe new features get added late in the game, or maybe stakeholders decide they want more testing than we originally agreed on.
Right.
So that can really throw off the whole schedule.
Yeah, definitely. So how do you prevent that from happening?
Well, the most important thing is to have a really clear and well-defined scope from the beginning. And then you also need a process for managing any changes that come up.
So if someone asks for like an extra test, you have a way to evaluate it and decide if it's really necessary.
Exactly, yeah. You have to prioritize and make sure it's not derailing the whole plan.
Gotcha. So is there anything else we need to include in our test plan?
One last thing, and it's an important one, the deliverables.
Okay.
So what documents and reports are we going to produce during the testing process?
Okay.
Things like, the test cases themselves, any bug reports, test summary reports, and even user acceptance testing documentation.
So basically we're just documenting everything and making sure we have a clear record of the entire process.
Exactly, yeah. Documentation is key. It helps you track progress, communicate findings, and it can even be really valuable for future projects.
Yeah, you can learn from your past experiences.
Absolutely.
Okay, so now we've got a pretty good understanding of the key components of a test plan, right?
I think so, yeah. We've covered a lot of ground.
So what's next? How do we actually create one of these things? Like, where do we start?
All right, so now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of how to build a test plan step by step.
Awesome. That's exactly what I was hoping for. I'm ready to roll up my sleeves and get into the details.
Let's do it.
Okay, so where do we actually begin when we're like building this test plan?
Right. Well, remember those test objectives we were talking about earlier?
Yeah.
That's our first step.
Okay.
Defining those. So those are the goals, what we want to get out of this whole testing process. It's like, setting that destination for our testing journey.
Okay, so like how do we figure out what those objectives should be? Is it just a matter of saying like, okay, we want to test everything?
Well, no, not really. It's a bit more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
We need to really think about what kind of software we're dealing with, like what it's actually going to be used for, and what the potential risks are.
Right.
So, for example, if we're working on, let's say, a financial application, then obviously security testing is going to be a super high priority.
Yeah, of course, you don't want any, like, loopholes where someone could get in and access people's financial information.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a huge risk.
Right.
But on the other hand, if you're building something like a mobile game,
Okay.
then your focus might shift more to like performance testing, usability testing, making sure the gameplay is smooth, it's engaging.
Right, that it's actually fun to play.
Exactly, yeah.
So the objectives really depend on, like, what the software is all about and what's most important for it to be successful.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, cool.
And it's also really smart to bring in the stakeholders early on in this process, get their input and make sure that what you're testing aligns with what they expect and what the overall goals of the project are.
Right, yeah, you don't want to be testing for things that no one actually cares about.
Exactly, yeah, you got to make sure it's relevant.
Okay, so once we have those objectives all figured out, what's next?
So then we can move on to outlining the scope of testing.
Right, and that's where we decide, like, what's actually getting tested and what isn't.
Exactly.
We're
Yeah.
drawing those boundaries.
Yep. We're setting those boundaries and we're also, thinking about what to prioritize.
Okay.
So we need to figure out which features, which functionalities, maybe even which integrations are going to be included in this initial round of testing.
Okay, and what are some of the things that, like, influence those decisions?
Well, often time constraints are a big factor.
Oh, yeah, of course.
If you've got a tight deadline, you might have to focus on like the core features and leave some of the less critical things for later.
Right, it's like a balancing act.
Yeah, you got to be strategic.
Okay.
And then also, you have to think about your resources.
Right.
Do we have enough testers, enough devices, enough testing environments to cover everything we want to?
Okay, that makes sense.
Sometimes you just have to make choices.
And what if, like, during this scoping process, we realize there's, like, a potential risk? What happens then?
Well, that's where that risk assessment comes in.
Right.
We need to really think about how likely that risk is to actually happen.
Okay.
And then if it did happen, what would the impact be?
Okay.
And based on that, we can decide if it's something we need to address right away or if it can wait for a later phase.
So we're thinking ahead, trying to anticipate any problems that might come up.
Exactly, yeah. That's the key.
Okay, so it sounds like a good test plan
Mm-hmm.
is, like, not just something you write once and then forget about.
No, not at all.
It's constantly evolving
Absolutely. Yeah.
as you learn more about the software and the risks involved.
Yes, it's a living document.
Okay, so we've got our objectives, we've got our scope figured out. What's next?
So then we need to establish those testing criteria, those entry and exit points that we talked about.
Right, yeah.
So the entry criteria are basically the prerequisites, the things that have to be in place before we can even begin testing.
Okay, can you give us some examples of what those might be?
Yeah, so one common one is that all the test cases have been written and reviewed. So everyone's clear on exactly what needs to be tested and how we're going to do it.
So it's like a checklist of everything we need before we can start.
Yeah, exactly, like a pre-flight check.
Okay.
Another one might be that the testing environment is all set up and ready to go.
Right. You have all the hardware, the software, the network. Everything's good to go.
Exactly. Yeah, you don't want to start testing and then realize, oh, wait, we're missing something crucial.
No, definitely not.
And then sometimes, like, data setup is a really important entry criterion.
Okay.
So let's say you're testing an e-commerce app.
Okay.
You might need to have a database with like sample products, customer accounts, order information, all that stuff.
Right. So it actually feels like a real e-commerce site.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So those entry criteria are really important for getting things off to a smooth start.
Absolutely.
But what about the exit criteria?
Yeah.
Like, how do we know when we're actually done testing? How do we know we've done enough?
Right. So the exit criteria are the conditions that have to be met before we can say, okay, we're confident this software is ready to go.
Okay.
And this usually involves like a few different factors.
Okay. Like what?
Well, one common one is achieving a certain level of test coverage.
Okay. I mean, what does that mean?
So that's basically a metric that tells you what percentage of the software's code has actually been executed during the testing.
Oh, okay. So it's like a measure of how thoroughly you've tested everything.
Exactly.
The higher the percentage, the better.
Generally, yes, but it's not just about the quantity, it's also about the quality.
Right. So it's not just about checking boxes. It's about making sure you're testing the right things.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So what else might be included in those exit criteria?
Well, another one might be that all the critical bugs have been fixed.
Okay.
So a critical bug is one that like really impacts the functionality or the security of the software.
Right. Those are the big ones.
Yeah, those are the showstoppers.
You don't want to release something with those still in there.
No, absolutely not.
Okay, so what else?
And sometimes you might also include user acceptance testing as part of the exit criteria.
Okay, so that's where you actually have, like, real users try out the software,
Exactly, yeah.
and they give you feedback.
Yep. And that helps you make sure that it's actually meeting their needs and expectations.
That's really important.
Yeah, it is.
Because sometimes, the people who are building the software, they might have a different perspective than the people who are actually going to be using it.
Absolutely, yeah. That's why user feedback is so valuable.
Okay, so the exit criteria are basically our way of knowing whether the software is actually ready to be released.
Exactly, yeah. It's like the final checkpoint.
Okay, cool.
So once we have those entry and exit criteria all set, what's next?
I'm ready for the next step.
All right, so now we get to dive into developing our test strategy.
Okay.
This is where we figure out how we're actually going to do the testing, like what specific approaches and techniques are we going to use.
Okay.
Now, I know you've probably heard that there are like a ton of different types of software testing out there.
Yeah, it can be a little overwhelming.
Yeah, it definitely can be.
So can you maybe give me like a high-level overview of some of the most common approaches?
Absolutely.
Okay, great.
So one of the most basic distinctions is between black box testing and white box testing.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but I'm not entirely sure what they mean.
So in black box testing, the tester doesn't actually know anything about how the software works on the inside.
Okay.
They're just interacting with it like from the outside as a user would.
Okay, so it's like testing a car without knowing anything about the engine or how it works under the hood.
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
Okay.
And then white box testing is the opposite.
Okay.
So in that case, the tester actually has access to the source code.
Oh,
They understand how the software is built, how it's structured.
so it's like having that mechanic's view of the car.
Exactly, yeah.
You can see how all the parts work together.
Yep, and that lets them design tests that target very specific areas of the code and make sure that all the internal components are working correctly.
Okay, that makes sense.
So black box testing is about the external behavior of the software,
Right.
and white box testing is about the internal workings.
Gotcha.
And then within those broader categories, there are a bunch of specialized types of testing.
Okay, like what? Give me some examples.
Well, one common one is functional testing.
Okay.
And that's all about making sure that the software actually does what it's supposed to do.
Okay, that sounds pretty important.
Yeah, it's kind of the foundation.
Right.
So for example, if you're testing an e-commerce website, functional testing would be things like adding items to the cart, entering your shipping information, going through the checkout process, all that stuff.
Right, making sure all those features actually work.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And then another really important one is performance testing.
Okay.
So this is where you're checking how the software performs under different conditions. Like if there's a lot of users on it at the same time, or if it's dealing with a lot of data.
Right. I imagine that would be super important for things like social media apps or online games where there are a lot of people using them simultaneously.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, what else is there?
Well, security testing is obviously crucial for anything that handles sensitive information.
Right, right. You want to make sure people's data is protected.
Exactly, yeah.
So how do you test for security?
There are a few different ways.
Okay.
One is called penetration testing,
Okay.
and that's where you basically have ethical hackers try to break into the system.
Oh, wow.
But they're doing it to help you find weaknesses, not to actually steal anything.
Right, right. It's like a controlled experiment.
Exactly, yeah.
Cool.
And then there's vulnerability scanning,
Okay.
and that's where you use automated tools to look for known security flaws.
Okay, so it's like a combination of human expertise and technology.
Yep, you need both to do it effectively.
All right, what about usability testing? What's that all about?
So usability testing is all about how user-friendly the software is.
Okay.
So you're basically watching real users as they interact with the software.
Okay.
And you're getting their feedback on their experience. Like, is it easy to use? Is it intuitive?
Right, because sometimes the people who are building the software, they might not realize that something is confusing or difficult to use.
Absolutely. Yeah, they're too close to it.
Right, right.
So getting that outside perspective from actual users is super valuable.
Okay, cool.
And there are a ton of other specialized types of testing as well.
Wow, this is a lot.
Yeah, it can be.
But I'm guessing, you don't always need to do all of these types of testing.
No, not necessarily.
It depends on the software and what the risks are.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so once we've, chosen our testing approaches, what happens next?
So then we move on to assigning roles and responsibilities within the testing team.
Right, so we're figuring out who's doing what.
Exactly, he's in charge.
Yep, who's the captain, who's the crew. Okay, so who are the, key players on a typical testing team?
So usually you have a test lead
Okay.
who's kind of the overall boss of the whole testing process.
Okay.
They're making sure that everything stays on track, that any problems are addressed quickly.
So they're like the project manager for testing.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Okay, cool.
And then you have test engineers.
Okay.
And they're the ones who are actually doing the hands-on work of designing the tests, running them, and then reporting on the results.
Okay, so they're the ones who are like in the trenches actually finding the bugs.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so what kind of skills do they need to have?
Well, they need to have a really good understanding of all the different testing methodologies, the tools, the techniques,
Okay.
and they also need to be really good at communicating their findings.
Right, so they can explain to the developers what they found and how to fix it.
Exactly,
That's
yeah.
not cool.
And then, depending on the project, you might also have some specialized roles. Like, you might have automation engineers who are specifically focused on building automated tests.
Okay.
You might have performance testers who are experts in evaluating how the software handles, a lot of traffic or a lot of data. And you might have security testers who are really good at finding those vulnerabilities we were talking about.
Okay, so it's like building a team of specialists.
Yeah, exactly. You need people with different skills and expertise to cover all the bases.
Okay, that makes sense.
And of course, just like any team, communication and collaboration are super important.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
You need everyone working together towards the same goal.
Right.
And having those clearly defined roles and responsibilities really helps with that.
Okay, so we've got our team, we've got our roles. What's next?
Okay, so now we need to start thinking about the logistics of actually setting up the testing environment.
Okay.
So this is where we create like a realistic setting for our tests.
Okay.
One that closely mirrors the environment where the software will actually be used in the real world.
Right, because if you're testing something that's going to be used on like a bunch of different devices and operating systems, you want to make sure it works on all of them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you're testing a mobile app, for example, your testing environment should include like a whole bunch of different mobile devices, different operating systems, different network conditions.
Right, you want to make sure it works in all those different scenarios.
Yep. That's the goal.
Okay, cool.
And then you might also need to think about things like screen size, resolution, processing power, available memory, all that stuff.
Wow, there's a lot to consider.
Yeah, there is.
What about software configurations?
Right. Yeah, that's important too.
Okay.
You need to make sure that you're testing the software on the correct versions of any supporting software,
Okay.
like databases, web servers, third-party libraries, all that stuff.
Right, so it's not just about the hardware, it's also about the software environment.
Exactly. Yeah, it all has to work together.
Okay, that makes sense.
And sometimes you might even need to create multiple testing environments to simulate different scenarios.
Okay, like what?
So, for example, you might have one environment for testing the basic functionality of the software,
Okay.
and then another environment for testing how it performs under like a heavy load.
Right, right.
So it can get pretty complex.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
But it's really important to get this right, because if your testing environment isn't realistic, then your results aren't going to be very meaningful.
Right, you're not really testing it in the way that it's going to be used.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we've got our testing environment all set up. What comes next?
So now it's time to create a schedule.
Okay.
And this is where we break down the testing process into different phases and assign deadlines to each phase.
Okay.
And of course, we always have to keep in mind that time is a precious resource.
Yeah, especially in software development, everything's always moving so fast.
Exactly. Yeah.
So what are some of the like key things to think about when we're creating this testing schedule?
Well, first of all, we need to estimate how long each phase is going to take.
Okay.
And that involves thinking about things like how complex is the software? How many test cases do we have?
Right.
And then also, how many people do we have available to do the testing?
Right, and it's important to be realistic about those estimates, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You don't want to set deadlines that you can't possibly meet.
No, that just sets everyone up for failure.
Right.
It's much better to overestimate than to underestimate.
Okay.
And it's also smart to build in some buffer time,
Okay.
just in case things take longer than expected, which they often do.
Right. Right.
Because you never know. You might run into some bugs that need to be fixed.
Right.
Or maybe the requirements change and you have to do some extra testing.
Right. Right. So it's all about being flexible and adaptable.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so once we have our schedule all figured out,
Yeah.
what's the final step?
Okay, so the final step, and this is super important, is to document everything.
Okay.
So we're taking all the stuff we've talked about, the objective, the scope, the strategy, the schedule, all of it,
Okay.
and we're putting it into a clear, concise document that everyone can refer to.
Okay, so it's like our official roadmap for the testing process.
Exactly.
Yeah, great.
And it's important to get everyone on board with this document.
Right.
So we want to involve all the key
I
stakeholders,
know.
get their feedback, make sure they're happy with it, and that everyone's committed to following it.
Right, so it's a collaborative effort.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, so now we've got our test plan all built, but are there like any best practices that we can follow to make sure it's really successful? Like, are there any tips or tricks that you can share?
Absolutely, yeah. There are definitely some things you can do to take your test planning to the next level and avoid some common pitfalls.
Okay, awesome. I'm ready to learn. Okay, awesome. Ready to learn.
Okay, so one of the most important best practices is to really prioritize your testing based on risk.
Okay.
Because not all features or functionalities are, created equal.
Right.
Some have a way bigger impact if they fail.
Okay, so it's about focusing our energy where it matters most.
Exactly.
Like, what's the biggest bang for our buck in terms of testing?
Yeah, precisely.
Okay, so can you give me an example?
Yeah, so think about like an e-commerce application.
Okay.
Payment processing, that's like a super high risk area.
Right.
Because if a customer can't actually buy something because there's a bug in the payment gateway,
Right.
that's a direct hit to the business.
Yeah, they're losing money.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So that makes sense why you'd want to prioritize that.
Absolutely.
So how do we actually like figure out which areas are the riskiest?
So it involves really thinking about a few things. Like how likely is it that this particular feature is going to fail?
Okay.
And then if it does fail, what's the impact going to be? Is it
Okay.
going to affect a lot of users?
Okay.
Is it going to cost the company money?
Right.
Could it even damage their reputation?
Right. Those are all important things to consider.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So some features might be like really complex and therefore more likely to have errors.
Right.
So those would be high risk.
Exactly.
But then some features might be simple, but if they fail, it's like a really big deal.
Yeah, exactly.
So those would also be high risk.
Yeah. So we want to make sure we're putting our testing efforts where they're going to have the biggest impact.
Okay. That makes sense.
And another really important best practice is to get your stakeholders involved early on.
Okay.
And I mean, like throughout the whole process.
Okay. So why is that so important?
Because testing shouldn't happen in isolation, you know?
Right.
It needs to be aligned with what everyone else is doing and what the overall goals of the project are.
Okay.
So by bringing in stakeholders like your product managers, your business analysts, even your end users,
Okay.
you're making sure that the testing is actually relevant and focused on the things that they care about.
Right. So it's all about communication and collaboration,
Yeah.
making sure everyone's on the same page.
exactly.
And the stakeholders can provide valuable feedback
Absolutely.
that can help shape the testing plan.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. So what else, what other best practices should we keep in mind?
So another one, and this is kind of related to what we were just talking about, is to regularly update the test plan.
Okay, so I thought the test plan was supposed to be like our roadmap.
Right.
Like, shouldn't it be pretty stable?
Well, it is a framework, but a good test plan is never really set in stone.
Okay.
You know, software development is an iterative process. Things change.
Right.
New features get added sometimes. You run into unexpected challenges.
So we need to be flexible
Exactly.
and willing to adjust the plan as we go.
Yep. You got to adapt.
Okay, cool. So what else?
So here's one that can save you a ton of time and effort. Utilize automated testing whenever you can.
Okay, so this is where we bring in the robots.
Yeah, kind of. So automated testing is really good for tasks that are like super repetitive or time consuming or things that are really prone to human error if a person was doing them.
Right.
So can you give me some examples of where automation would be a good fit?
Yeah, so regression testing is a perfect example.
Okay.
Remember we talked about that earlier?
Yeah, that's where you're retesting stuff that's already been tested.
Right, just to make sure that a new code change didn't break anything.
Right.
That can be a really tedious process to do manually,
Yeah, I can imagine.
but a computer can do it really quickly and efficiently.
So we can let the machines handle the boring stuff.
Exactly, and that frees up the human testers to focus on the more interesting and challenging aspects of testing.
Okay, that makes sense.
And automation can also be really helpful for performance testing,
Okay.
where you need to simulate a lot of users or a lot of transactions to see how the software holds up under pressure.
Right.
That's something that's really hard to do manually.
Okay. All right. So another best practice, and this one's often overlooked, is maintaining traceability throughout the whole process.
Okay, traceability. Not really sure what that means.
So traceability basically means that you can trace every single test case back to the original requirement that it's supposed to be validating.
Oh, okay, so we know exactly why we're running each test and what it's supposed to prove.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this helps make sure that all your testing efforts are actually aligned with what you set out to do in the first place.
Right, and you're not wasting time testing things that aren't important.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so traceability, it's like having a clear audit trail.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it.
Okay, cool. So these best practices are super helpful, but can you give me like a real-world example of how they all come together?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's look at a company called FinTrust.
Okay.
They're a fintech startup, and they were developing a mobile banking app.
Huh. High stakes.
Yeah, very high stake.
Security is super important for something like that.
Absolutely. So security was their top priority, and they really embraced risk-based testing. They focused heavily on security testing right from the start.
Okay.
They brought in security experts, they brought in ethical hackers to try to find any vulnerabilities,
Okay.
and they designed really thorough test cases to make sure everything was secure.
So they were proactive about it.
Yeah,
They
exactly.
didn't wait for problems to come up. They went looking for them.
Exactly.
Okay.
And they also used a lot of automated testing for regression testing.
Okay.
So every time they made a change to the code, they could quickly and easily make sure that it hadn't broken any of the existing security features.
Okay. That's really smart.
Yeah, it saved them a lot of time and effort.
What about stakeholder involvement? How did they handle that?
So they had regular meetings with the product managers, the designers, even potential users,
Okay.
just to get feedback on the app's usability and security.
Okay.
They wanted to make sure that it was easy to use, but also that people felt like their money was safe.
Right, because that's really important for a banking app.
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
And then they were also very diligent about maintaining that traceability we talked about.
Okay.
So every test case was linked back to a specific security requirement.
Okay.
So they had a really clear audit trail.
Okay.
And they knew that they were covering all the bases.
So what were the results of all this meticulous planning?
Well, they were able to launch their app with a lot of confidence.
Okay.
They knew that they had done everything they could to make it secure and functional.
Yeah.
And the app actually got really positive reviews from users.
That's awesome.
Yeah, they were really happy with it.
Ooh.
So it's a great example of how a really well-executed test plan can lead to success,
Yeah, it's not just about finding bugs.
right?
It's about making sure that the software is high quality,
Yeah,
that it's secure, and that it's actually usable.
exactly. It's about delivering a product that people love and that meets their needs.
I think this deep dive into test planning has been incredibly insightful.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
I feel like I have a much better understanding of how important this is.
Yeah, it's often overlooked, but it's really crucial.
Yeah, and I think the biggest takeaway for me is that a good test plan, it's not just something you create once and then forget about.
Right?
It's a living document that needs to be constantly updated and refined
Right.
as the software evolves.
Yep, you got to stay flexible.
So thanks for walking me through all of this. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Happy to help.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and I'm feeling much more confident about tackling test planning in my own work.
That's great to hear.
And you know, it makes me wonder if these same principles could be applied to other areas of life as well,
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
like planning a big event
Right.
or even just organizing your day-to-day life.
I think there are definitely some parallels there.
Something to think about.
Food for thought.
Well, thanks again for joining me for this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you next time.